Hello, welcome to the project How Epidemics End, which is based at the University of Oxford. I'm Kristen Heitman, and with me today are Dora Vargha and Arthur Rose to talk about the nature and the power of epidemic narratives. Dora is professor of history and medical humanities at the University of Exeter in the UK. She works primarily in the history of epidemics, the politics of health, and Cold War history, from the politics of epidemic management to public health systems and access to therapeutics. Arthur is a postdoctoral research fellow in English at the University of Exeter, where he works with Luna Dolezal on the Wellcome Trust-funded Shame and Medicine Project, an AHRC UKRI project, Scenes of Shame and Stigma in COVID-19. He's particularly interested in questions of narrative, emotion, and philosophy of history and literary scholarship. Welcome to both of you. So this interview is part of a long-running conversation, primarily between Arthur and Dora, that I've been privileged to be part of recently, about the nature of narrative and history, and now in particular about epidemics. So like many others who've discussed epidemic narratives, we've decided to take as our jumping off point the model first broached by the historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg. Arthur and Dora, how would you characterize that model?
In literary scholarship, we tend to start by going back to the text. So I'm going to just read, I think, one of the potentially the most important lines from Rosenberg's piece for how we think about the model of the epidemic. Rosenberg writes, epidemics start at a point in time, proceed on a stage limited in space and duration, follow a plot line of increasing and revelatory tension, move to a crisis of individual and collective character, and then drift towards closure. Now, I think it's worth remarking on the distinction that a literary scholar would make between closure and ending, because whereas ending is when something comes to a stop in a kind of external sense, closure is much more to do with the expectations and questions that an audience bring to a dramatic piece. Obviously, drama, and modern drama particularly, is often as much about the absence of closure as it is about closure per se. But it's worth remembering, and here I take the work of H. Abbott Porter, or H. Porter Abbott, as my starting point, that closure is very much about resolving your expectations and answering any as yet unanswered questions. And what is, I think, maybe supports Dora's point about the fact that endings often don't unravel historically as neatly as Rosenberg maybe portrays them, is that in addition to that, the reason why they don't unravel in these kind of easy ways isn't just because of the external historical factors, but also because the people involved are often left with unresolved expectations and unresolved questions.
I think there are two things to consider here. One is a point that he makes in other pieces that he's written, that epidemics serve as a sampling device, as a window into seeing things going on in society and politics and culture that we wouldn't otherwise see. And that remains, I think, a very strong point. However, I think that this overarching narrative and imagining epidemics as a play that goes through acts in a particular sequence brings up certain issues. In this case, particularly with the ending, and I think through this problematizing the ending and how we might think about models, and what models, not just Rosenberg's, but more in general, can reveal about endings, can then help us rethink what epidemics are in the first place and how they play out.
So one of the interesting things that actually each of you has said in other conversations is that the responses to Rosenberg's model that one has really reflect one's own priorities. And so the objections to the model tend to be in part about one's own expectations about what a model ought to accomplish in terms of describing what a narrative looks like, and in particular, what an epidemic narrative looks like. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. I'd like to, tie that into with something that Arthur just mentioned, and this is why I find our conversations so fruitful, because there are always very constructive overlaps, but also disagreements encoded in this. And I think that reflects our priorities from coming from our disciplines and some of our personal interests as well that are folded into this. And I'd like to go back to what you said, Arthur, about modern drama. And how I find that really useful as a vehicle to really think about, okay, this is not necessarily a model, a dramaturgy, like the dramaturgy itself is already problematic, and it can be problematized in that way. And I find that useful to think about, okay, what does modern drama do? What kind of actors and tensions and taking apart of conventions it's working with that we can utilize to rethink how we tell a story and a narrative in a historical sense. But I would also push back against this distinction between, I completely agree that I think the distinction between ending and closure is important. But coming from a historical perspective, I think that they collapse into each other more easily. And what I mean by this is that the external and the personal are not divisible in this sense, because the ending that, what ending might mean is what you would term as closure when the WHO says that this epidemic has ended, or when a state is no longer, governments are no longer invested in it, or there's medical research stops giving it a heightened priority, and so on and so forth. And that comes together with the fact that closure as such on a very personal and individual level also may come, and it, historically we can see that it does come in very different times for very different actors, if we want to use that term. So there is a complexity here that ending as something external is very much embedded with the closure, and there can be various expressions of this, like a commemoration of an epidemic, thinking about plague columns, for instance, in the 18th century, that relegate something into the past, both on a social level, on a cultural level. It has very strong political meanings. And that is an act of creating that closure that may or may not be overlap with the ending itself. So I think that's where my interest is coming into it, of what is belonging to that, who's making that decision, who is propelling these endings, who is propelling, the way that the model is, the way that the story is being told, what kind of story is being told, and who gets included into that and who doesn't. I feel that what kind of narratives we have to make sense of what has happened, and making sense is telling the story of what had gone before and how did we get to where we are right now. So very broadly speaking, and that can be told in many ways. It can be interpreted in many ways, the facts and the events that are happening. It depends on who we are looking at, what kind of actors we're taking into account, and there can be parallel narratives going on at the same time. But what makes, I think, it particularly historical, what is important from a historical perspective, is that all this narrative and the way that we are making sense of it is bound by the sources that we use in our research. So the documents that have been produced, the people who have, whose stories we can access. And there are, a lot of ways to do it, and that gives an explanation of the varied narratives that are going on. But it is bound by that very material side of the story.
Arthur, what do you see as being characteristic of historical narratives that differ somehow from literary ones, if they do, or insofar as they do?
I mean, there's a very easy way of answering that question, which is that ultimately the relationship to death, which is to say, when you're talking about an actual epidemic, historical epidemic, you're talking about actual people who have died. And no matter how responsive to an actual historical figure a literary narrative will be, the death in literature is always a fictional death. And I think it's partly one of the great privileges of my conversation with Dora, that we always, when I get too excited about models and narrative modes and things like that, she pulls me back with the fact that we're talking about real people in the world who have lived in the world, who suffered in the world, and who have died in the world. That said, it is to concede a little too much to historians for the literary scholar to always say, well, we just look at fiction and put up their hands and say, oh, well, you know, it's like, of course, we're not talking about the real world. And I think that's the case for two reasons, which is that if one thinks of the distinction between the facticity of artifacts or things we study in the humanities along the lines of a distinction that John Guillory makes between monuments and documents, wherein a monument may talk about an actual statue or something like that, but it can equally be a novel or something, a fact in the world or something like that. And you think about documents then as the accoutrement of textual apparatus that respond to that monument. Then one can start to think about the ways that particular works, although they may be works of fiction, have exerted their own pull and influence and locus of gravity on the way that material historical facts have played themselves out. And in this respect, we might return to Rosenberg and think of Rosenberg's, which is the second point that I'm making, Rosenberg's model not simply as an explanation of epidemics, as the title of his book suggests, but also as a particularly influential model for how people think that they need to live through an epidemic. Now, in that sense, when a model presents the span of an epidemic as something that gradually unfolds and then has a moment of crisis and then comes to a kind of point of closure or ending, one is less likely to be sensitive to the fact that epidemics, as they unfolded historically, have never really followed the model, right? They've always been more complicated than that model allows. I mean, one just needs to think of the Spanish influenza and the fact that there were 3 waves as a sample of why a model that is, say, overly linear or overly emphasizes overly the traditional curve that Dora sketched out for us earlier, is going to set up unreasonable expectations, which brings us back to this kind of question of closure as the resolution of a set of expectations.
And I would just add to that this is where I think it really matters why, how we think about literary narratives and historical narratives, and how we tell the stories of the past, or how we think about dramaturgy models, because this is, it makes for a very interesting academic conversation, as Arthur and I have been, there's a reason why we've been having these conversations for a while now. But there is a real stake in this, and just picking up on what Arthur was saying, that the way that we perceive the epidemic narrative, the way that we perceive these models, maybe they be epidemiological models, that get folded into this story, or the narratives that people tell about their own individual illness, which may cause frustrations. I've had COVID. Why am I still struggling with this? It's supposed to be over, and but then it has also other real stakes in what do we understand as an ending. How do we construct that closure if the ending is no more cases, or very little cases, or not enough cases to create a public health concern? If that is where an epidemic ends, then what happens to the people who are not experiencing it on that timeline? What happens to the, if we're following that narrative as a government, or as a world, international organization, or as a narrower community, what is that? What is that work that the narrative is doing? And I think we need to be just conscious of that it is doing very, very real and palpable work in how we're drawing imagined narratives, may they be historical or fictional, of past epidemics, and how we're using that to make sense of what's going on right now. And it's just that action that I think it needs to be, we need to be aware that is part of what we're doing. We are telling, it's not a objective thing that we're living through, that plays out in a certain way. We are participating in creating that story.
I hope this conversation continues for a very long time. It's been very interesting and a lot of fun just to listen to the two of you exchange insights and opinions. And I hope to see more of it in the future. So thank you both very much.